This 1867 portrait of a teacher looks calm until you notice the empty desk. It seemed like a perfectly ordinary photograph at first, a composed woman in dark fabric seated beside a chalkboard, hands folded in her lap. The kind of image you might find illustrating a chapter on post-war American education, unremarkable and vaguely inspiring. Until one small detail would not let the investigator go. Her name was Rachel Okonkwo, and she had been cataloging photographs for the Virginia Historical Consortium for 11 years. The collection had arrived in early March, donated from the estate of a family whose line had ended with the death of a 93-year-old man in a Richmond nursing home. 14 boxes of tintypes, cartes de visite, and cabinet cards, most of them the usual fare. Stern-faced patriarchs, children posed with rocking horses, wedding portraits where nobody smiled. Rachel had processed over 40,000 images in her career. She knew the visual grammar of 19th century photography the way a translator knows verb conjugations. And something about this photograph refused to fit. The woman in the portrait sat in a small schoolroom. Behind her, a slate board showed a few chalked letters, partially erased. To her left stood a small wooden desk, the kind meant for a single child, with an inkwell set into the corner and a hinged top for storing slates and primers. The desk was empty. No child sat there, no books rested on its surface, and yet it had been placed deliberately in the frame, angled toward the camera as if someone were meant to be seen occupying it. Rachel adjusted the archival lamp and leaned closer. The teacher's face was serene, her posture perfect, but her eyes were not on the camera. They were on the empty desk. She had seen memorial photographs before, images taken to honor the dead, but those usually featured something. A wreath of flowers, a draped cloth, a framed portrait of the deceased. This desk was simply vacant, and the longer Rachel looked at it, the more the absence seemed to have weight, as if the photograph were not just showing a teacher, but pointing at something that should have been there and was not. She turned the card over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written a single line. M. Caldwell, teacher, Hardin Company, 1867. No first name, no school name, just initials and a place. Rachel set the photograph aside and told herself she would return to it later. But by the time she locked up the archive that evening, she already knew she was not going to let it go. Rachel had not planned to become an archivist. She had started in fine art conservation, spending her 20s in climate-controlled rooms repairing Renaissance panel paintings and 19th century oil portraits. But after a fellowship at a small museum in Charleston, she had been drawn into photograph preservation and then into research. The physical artifact was only half the work. The other half was understanding what you were looking at. She had developed a reputation for what her colleagues called the long look, a willingness to sit with an image for hours, days, even weeks, until some overlooked detail revealed itself. A reflection in a window, a shadow that did not match, a hand gripping something just out of frame. Most photographs from the 1860s were staged with care, every object chosen for meaning. And yet scholars often treated them as neutral documents, as if a camera simply recorded what was there without intent. Rachel knew better. Every image was an argument. The question was what the argument was trying to hide. The Caldwell photograph pulled at her because of the contradiction. Memorial images were meant to mourn. But this one did not feel like mourning. The teacher's posture was too upright, her expression too controlled. If anything, she looked defiant, and that empty desk, positioned so deliberately, felt less like grief and more like accusation. Rachel returned to the archive the next morning with a notebook and a magnifying loupe. She removed the photograph from its protective sleeve and examined it under raking light. The surface showed the slight silvering of age, but no cracks or major deterioration. A professional job, likely from an established studio. She tilted the card and caught the faint embossment of a studio mark in the lower right corner. Pemberton and Hale, Norfolk, VA. Norfolk, not Hardin County. The photograph had been taken in a city nearly 200 miles from where the pencil inscription placed Miss Caldwell. That meant the teacher had traveled, or the image had. Either way, there was more to this than a simple school portrait. Rachel pulled up historical directories for Norfolk and began searching for Pemberton and Hale. She found a listing from 1866 onward, a commercial photography studio on Main Street near the waterfront. The firm had operated until 1879, when a fire destroyed the building along with most of its records. No client ledgers survived, but the embossed mark confirmed the date range. This photograph had been taken between 1866 and 1879. The pencil inscription said 1867. If that was accurate, then Emsa Caldwell had sat for this portrait just 2 years after the end of the war, 2 years after emancipation. Rachel paused and looked at the teacher again. The woman's skin was light, her features difficult to read in the soft focus of the wet plate process. Her dress was modest but well made, appropriate for a schoolteacher. Her hair was pulled back under a plain cap. Nothing about her appearance marked her as anything other than a respectable white woman of modest means. But Hardin County, Virginia, in 1867 was not a place where respectable white women typically taught school. The county had been heavily agricultural before the war, its economy built on tobacco and the labor of enslaved people. After emancipation, the Freedmen's Bureau had established schools throughout the region, staffed largely by black teachers and northern missionaries. If Emsa Caldwell had been teaching in Hardin County in 1867, there was a strong chance she had been teaching in one of those schools. And if that was the case, the question of the empty desk became something else entirely. Rachel reached out to a colleague at Howard University, a historian named Dr. Leonard Mosley, who specialized in Reconstruction-era education. She sent him a high-resolution scan of the photograph along with the inscription and asked if the name M. Caldwell appeared in any records of freedmen's schools in Virginia. His reply came 2 days later, longer than she expected. "The name shows up once," he wrote, "Mary Caldwell, listed as a teacher of colored children in an 1867 report from the Freedmen's Bureau office in Hardin County. The report notes that her school operated out of a converted barn on the edge of a property formerly belonging to a man named James Whitley. The school enrolled approximately 30 students, ages 6 to 14. It closed in the spring of 1868. Rachel read the message twice. A school that operated for only a year. A teacher who appeared in one report and then vanished. She asked Mosley if he knew why the school had closed. "The report doesn't say," he replied, "but I can tell you it wasn't unusual. Freedmen's schools faced constant threats. Arson, assault, intimidation. Some teachers were run out of town, some were killed, and sometimes the closures were quieter than that. Sometimes the students simply stopped coming." He attached a scan of the original report. Rachel opened it and found the passage. Mrs. Mary Caldwell, teacher, conducted a school of 30 pupils until the spring of 1868, when enrollment declined sharply and the school was discontinued. Enrollment declined sharply. A bureaucratic phrase that said nothing about why. Rachel returned to the photograph and studied the empty desk again. It was small, meant for a young child, perhaps 6 or 7 years old. The inkwell was empty. The hinged top was closed. But now that she looked closely, she could see something she had missed before. There was a mark on the desk's surface, near the front edge. Not a stain, a carving. 2 letters, roughly scratched into the wood. E.W. She pulled up census data for Hardin County and began searching for children with those initials who would have been the right age in 1867. The 1870 census listed dozens of families, but cross-referencing with Freedmen's Bureau records narrowed the field. She found one match that made her stop: Eliza Whitley, age 9 in 1870, formerly enslaved, listed as living in the household of James Whitley, the same man whose property had housed Mary Caldwell's school. Her occupation was recorded as domestic servant, a 9-year-old domestic servant in 1870, which meant she would have been 6 or 7 in 1867, the year the photograph was taken. Rachel felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came when a story began to cohere, a child's initials carved into a desk, a school that closed when enrollment declined, and a photograph of a teacher staring at an empty seat. She needed to know what had happened to Eliza Whitley. The answer came from an unexpected source. Dr. Mosley connected her with a legal historian at the University of Richmond, a woman named Dr. Catherine Frayne, who had spent years documenting the apprenticeship system that operated in Virginia during Reconstruction. Apprenticeship was the loophole, Dr. Frayne explained over the phone. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery except as punishment for crime, but it said nothing about children, and the southern states moved fast to exploit that silence. She described how, in the months after the war, state legislatures passed laws allowing county courts to bind black children to white employers, often their former enslavers, as apprentices. The justification was always the same. The children were orphans, or their parents were too poor to care for them, or the home was deemed unsuitable. In practice, the laws allowed white landowners to reclaim free black children and put them back to work under conditions nearly identical to slavery. The child's consent was irrelevant, Dr. Frayne said. The parents' consent was often not required. A judge could sign the order and the child would be taken. Sometimes the families fought back, sometimes they won, but the process was stacked against them. Rachel asked if there were records of such cases in Hardin County. There should be, Dr. Frayne said. County court records from that period are scattered, but some survived. If a family contested an apprenticeship, there would be a filing. 2 weeks later, Rachel was sitting in a county records office in rural Virginia, paging through a crumbling leather-bound volume of court proceedings from 1867. The clerk had warned her that the indexing was incomplete and the handwriting was often illegible, but halfway through the volume, she found what she was looking for. In the matter of the minor child, Eliza, formerly the property of James Whitley, now claimed as apprentice by the same. The filing was dated November 1867. It recorded that James Whitley had petitioned the court to bind Eliza, age 7, to his household as an apprentice until she reached the age of 18. The petition stated that the child's mother was deceased and her father was unknown, and that Whitley was willing to provide for her education and upkeep in exchange for her labor. But the filing also recorded an objection. A woman named Mary Caldwell had appeared before the court to contest the apprenticeship. She claimed that Eliza's mother was not deceased, but had been sold away before the war and was believed to be living in North Carolina. She further claimed that Eliza had been attending school and was thriving under the care of the freed people's community, and that binding her to Whitley would deprive her of education and return her to a condition of servitude. The court's decision was recorded on the following page. The objection was overruled. Eliza was bound to James Whitley. Rachel sat in the quiet of the records room and felt the weight of what she was reading. A teacher had gone to court to save one of her students. She had lost, and then she had gone to a photography studio in Norfolk and sat for a portrait with an empty desk beside her. The photograph was not a memorial. It was evidence. It was a teacher saying, "This child was here, this child was mine to protect, and this child was taken." Rachel brought her findings back to the Virginia Historical Consortium and requested a meeting with the curatorial board. She wanted to recontextualize the photograph, to build a small exhibition around it that would tell the story of Mary Caldwell, Eliza Whitley, and the apprenticeship system that had stripped thousands of black children from their families in the years after emancipation. The meeting did not go the way she expected. The director, a careful man named Harold Vance, listened to her presentation with his hands folded on the table. When she finished, he asked how certain she was of the identification. "The initials match," Rachel said. "The timeline matches. The court record names Mary Caldwell specifically as the objector. But we don't have definitive proof that this photograph depicts the same Mary Caldwell," Vance said. "We don't have a confirmed image of her from another source. We're inferring." "We're interpreting," Rachel said, which is what curators do. A woman from the development office, whose name Rachel did not catch, raised another concern. The consortium had recently received a significant donation from a family foundation connected to one of the old Tidewater families. Not the Whitleys, but families like them. Families whose ancestors had owned plantations, who had built the wealth that now funded museums and universities and concert halls. If the consortium began producing exhibitions that accused those ancestors of re-enslaving children, the foundation might reconsider its support. Rachel felt her jaw tighten. "So we're supposed to keep the photograph in a drawer because it might upset donors?" "We're supposed to be careful," Vance said. "We're supposed to present history responsibly, and that means not making claims we can't fully substantiate." The meeting ended without a decision. Rachel was asked to prepare a more detailed report and submit it for further review. She left the building and walked 3 blocks before she trusted herself to speak. That evening, she called Dr. Frayne and described what had happened. The legal historian was quiet for a moment. "You know," she said, "there may be another way to substantiate the story. If Mary Caldwell contested the apprenticeship in court, she probably didn't stop there. The Freedmen's Bureau kept records of complaints. If she filed anything with them, it might still exist. The National Archives held the Freedmen's Bureau records. Rachel submitted a research request and waited. The response came 6 weeks later. A scan of a handwritten letter dated December 1867, addressed to the Assistant Commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau in Richmond. The letter was signed by Mary Caldwell. "I write to report the unlawful seizure of a child from my school," the letter began. "Eliza, age 7 years, was taken by court order and bound to Mr. James Whitley, who held her mother in bondage before the war and who now claims her labor under the pretense of apprenticeship. I appeared in court to object but was overruled. I ask that the Bureau investigate this matter and take action to restore the child to freedom." The letter went on for 2 pages, describing Eliza's progress in school, her aptitude for reading, her dreams of becoming a teacher herself. It described the conditions on Whitley's property, where Eliza had been put to work in the kitchen and the fields. It described the fear in the freed people's community, the other children who had been taken, the sense that emancipation had been a lie. "I do not write only for Eliza," Mary Caldwell concluded. "I write for every child in this county who has been stolen from their family and returned to bondage in all but name. The law has failed them. I pray the Bureau will not." There was a note clipped to the letter, added by a bureau clerk. It read, "Referred to local agent for investigation. No further action on file." No further action. Rachel read the letter 3 times. She could hear Mary Caldwell's voice in it, the carefully controlled anger, the appeal to law and morality, the desperation beneath the formal language, and she could see now why the teacher had gone to Norfolk and sat for that photograph. She had done everything she could through official channels. She had lost. And so she had created a record that no one could burn or misfile or refer to a clerk who would do nothing. She had made sure that someone, someday, would see that empty desk and ask what had happened to the child who belonged there. Rachel presented her new findings to the board in a second meeting. This time she came with the letter, the court record, the Freedmen's Bureau report, and a detailed timeline showing how all the pieces fit together. She also came with something else, a descendant. Through Dr. Frayn's network, she had made contact with a woman in North Carolina named Denise Whitley Monroe, a retired schoolteacher whose family had traced their lineage back to the enslaved people of Hardin County. Denise's great-great-grandmother had been a woman named Louisa, sold away from Virginia in 1859 and separated from her daughter. The daughter's name was Eliza. Denise had grown up hearing the story. Louisa had spent years after the war trying to find her child. She had written letters, hired agents, traveled to Virginia twice. She never found Eliza. She died in 1902, still searching. "My grandmother used to say Eliza was the ghost in our family," Denise told the board via video link, "the one we couldn't bury because we didn't know what happened to her. And now you're telling me there was a teacher who tried to save her, a teacher who went to court and wrote letters and took a photograph to make sure somebody remembered." She paused, her voice thick. "I want to see that photograph. I want it to be shown. I want people to know that Eliza existed and that someone fought for her, even if they lost." The room was quiet. Harold Vance looked at the image on the screen, the composed teacher, the empty desk, the carved initials barely visible at the edge of the frame. "All right," he said finally. "Let's build the exhibition." The exhibition opened in October, titled "The Empty Desk: Education, Apprenticeship, and the Theft of Black Childhood After Emancipation." The photograph of Mary Caldwell was displayed at the center, enlarged and backlit, with a panel explaining the story of Eliza Whitley and the system that had taken her. Beside it were copies of the court record, the Freedmen's Bureau letter, and a family tree showing Eliza's descendants and the generations of searching that had followed her disappearance. Denise Whitley Monroe spoke at the opening. She stood in front of the photograph and talked about what it meant to finally have a face to put with the story, a moment frozen in time when someone had said no to what was happening. She talked about her grandmother, who had kept a photograph of Louisa on her mantle and had told the story of the lost child every Christmas. She talked about the other families whose children had been taken, the thousands of apprenticeships that had never been contested, the silence that had settled over the whole ugly system once Reconstruction ended and the federal government withdrew. "This photograph is a piece of evidence," she said, "but it's also a piece of resistance. Mary Caldwell could have walked away. She could have gone back north or found another school or just let the system win. Instead, she sat for this picture and made sure that desks stayed empty. She made sure we would see it and ask questions. And now we know what the answers are. The exhibition ran for 8 months. It was covered by regional newspapers and a documentary crew from a public television station. Scholars cited it in papers on Reconstruction-era labor systems. A high school history teacher in Richmond built a unit around it and had her students research apprenticeship cases in their own counties. And Rachel, watching from the edges, felt something she had not expected. Not satisfaction exactly, but a sense of a circle closing. A teacher had looked at an empty desk and refused to let the world forget. An archivist had looked at the same image 150 years later and understood. What Rachel learned, in the months after the exhibition opened, was that the Caldwell photograph was not unique. Other historians began reaching out, sharing images from their own collections that carried similar weight. A family portrait from South Carolina where one child's wrists showed faint marks beneath the lace of her sleeves. A group photograph from a Louisiana plantation where the black workers in the background were arranged in a formation that matched a military burial detail. Taken the same week, a local newspaper reported a disturbance among the freed people that left 3 dead. A daguerreotype from Maryland, where a young black girl stood behind a white child's chair, her hand on the chair's back, and the shadow on the floor showed the outline of a chain that didn't appear anywhere else in the image. Every photograph was a palimpsest. Every image from that era carried layers of intention, meaning, and concealment. The cameras of the 1860s and 1870s had been instruments of power, used to construct narratives of respectability, prosperity, and order. But they had also, sometimes, captured things they were not meant to capture. A hand positioned wrong, a reflection that showed too much, an empty space where someone should have been. Rachel returned to her work with new eyes. She taught workshops for other archivists on how to read 19th century photographs for evidence of coercion, resistance, and erasure. She built a database of images flagged for further research, and she kept the scan of Mary Caldwell's photograph pinned above her desk, the teacher's calm face looking out at her, the empty desk waiting in the frame. She thought about Eliza sometimes, the 7-year-old who had carved her initials into the wood, who had learned to read in a converted barn, who had been taken by court order and returned to the man who had once owned her mother. The records did not say what happened to her after 1867. She did not appear in the 1880 census. She was not listed among Whitley's household in any later document. She had vanished into the silence that swallowed so many black children of that era, the ones who were not killed or sold but simply worked and confined until they stopped appearing in the records at all. But the desk remained. The photograph remained. And the letter remained, Mary Caldwell's voice reaching across a century and a half to say, "This happened, and it was wrong, and I tried to stop it." That was the thing about archives. They held the silences as well as the sounds. They held the gaps, the absences, the questions that never got answered. And sometimes, if you sat with an image long enough, the silence began to speak. Rachel thought about all the portraits hanging in museums and textbooks, the respectable families and dignified ancestors, the images that had been curated and captioned and displayed without anyone asking what was missing from the frame. She thought about the children who had been cropped out, the workers who had been posed as props, the evidence of violence that had been developed and printed and sold and hung on walls as if it were simply a record of how things were. Every photograph was an argument. And the argument most photographs from that era were making was that the system was natural, that the hierarchies were fixed, that the people in the background did not have stories worth telling. Mary Caldwell had made a different argument. She had placed an empty desk in the frame and dared the future to ask why it was empty. It had taken 150 years for someone to ask. Rachel wondered how many other questions were waiting in the archives, in the attics and estate sales and church basements, in the boxes that got cataloged and filed and forgotten. She wondered how many empty desks were still out there, waiting for someone to notice. And she got back to work.